Rock Book Show. And today, to my left, you'll see the lovely and talented Eric Davidson. He is the author of We Never Learn, the Gunk Punk Undergut, 1988 to 2000.
2001 It's a bit of a mouthful. It's kind of a long...
I was trying to say it in the car, and I'm like, this is never going to come out on camera.
That rarely comes out of my mouth right either, but anyway.
And Eric, you may also recognize as the lead singer of New Bomb Turks, an amazing band. I'm glad you guys are still out there.
Well, thanks. Yeah, we sort of officially broke up on New Year's Eve of 2002 into 2003. We've been going for a long time, but we're all still pals. And I live in New York now. Those guys are all back still in Columbus, but we get together a couple times a year. Do a show here or there. We just did a festival in Spain and some shows in the south of France. And actually I have a new band called LividS, and we just played our first show on Saturday. So I probably should stop this crap one of these days, but it's a lot of fun.
Well, we're going to get more into the history of New Bomb Turks, but just to back up to the book for a minute, Gunk Punk, you are the coiner of the term, so please explain it to all of us who do not understand.
I will explain that I've never realized how important subtitles were to books. I just sort of knocked that off one day very early in the process because I like silly alliteration and rhyming. I just thought it sounded kind of funny. And then, literally almost 2 years later when the book was done, my editor was like, you have to have a subtitle. And if we just called it like the punk underground, people would think, oh, Mohawks and Sex Pistols or something. And if we called it the garage punk underground, anybody who would even have an inkling of what that might mean probably would think it was about like 60s style bands, like garage bands of the 60s or something, because that's kind of a whole other genre that I talk about a little bit in my book. So my editor's like, Gunk Punk sounds fine, it's kind of funny, and he asked me to kind of throw the phrase in a couple times here or there throughout the book. So really I wasn't really trying, one thing about bands and musicians in general, they hate when you like try to define them, no way, man, I play my music.
Or who do you sound like?
Yeah, they hate that crap. And I can understand that, but you got to have a subtitle. If you just called it We Never Learn, what is that? So, I wasn't really trying to just give everything one name because there's a lot of different bands in this book. There's, I think, 80 to 90 bands, and I interviewed more than that. And so it's covering a lot of different kind of bands.
So how do you pick who goes in, who doesn't? When you write something this encompassing, it's got to be really tough. And plus you had to go back and re-interview people or try to get people on the phone. And so what was that process like?
Yeah, I always joke with my friends that this book is about nearly 125 interviews, 80 to 90 bands over more than 10 years, and I keep joking that my next book is going to be about the night in the life of one guy, because it's just like it was a ton of interviews, mostly email, but a lot of in person and a lot of on the phone, and some follow-ups. And when you go into doing a book like this, again with music fans, you try to make any list or any kind of compendium of who's good and who's not. There's always going to be arguments and who should be included and who shouldn't. And when you do something like this, you just have to say, you know what, I was in what I would think was one of these bands. I'm not trying to be falsely modest. We're not a household name, but I think we were important within this little scene. And I've also been a music writer since 1989. So I feel like I just got to be confident and say, you know what, I'm just describing what I think these bands are, and these are the bands that I think kind of fall into this. I had to cut my original draft was twice as long as the book ended up being, so I had to cut out a lot of bands that I like, that I personally know. I had to cut out quotes from good friends, members of my own band. So, it wasn't easy at all. And, the first email you get from a lot of people are like, I liked your book, but what about band XYZ? They were awesome. So you just kind of have to be like, look, this is what I'm doing. I got to put the blinders on and not worry if every other guy in the world is going to email me and bitch at me for not writing up his friends.
Yeah, and I actually thought it was cool that you included in the book that email from Dave Kreider. Yeah. And he didn't want to rehash the old days and stuff.
Yeah, it was Dave's birthday just the other day. Happy birthday, Dave. And that's fine. He said it very nicely. He just said, look, I've been asked to do other interviews for what sounds like similar kind of books that are coming up. I'm sure yours will be good and well-informed and all that, but I just, and that's cool. As long as you're cool about it. There were a couple people I approached who were flat out not as cool. But I would say 95% of the people I approached were super cool and nice. And these are people who either were drunkards for decades on end, did copious amounts of illegal substances, or should be dead from either van crashes in the middle of the night or some sort of sexually transmitted disease, whatever. And they, and here they were more than willing. And a lot of them have kids and real jobs and mortgages. A lot of them are still drunks. And here they were, willing to talk about their life. So that was a lot of fun, and I really appreciated it. And not to toot my own horn, but I think the fact that I was in a band and I did sleep on people's floors and I did get drunk and have to sit in crappy backstages and everything, I think people could trust that I was really trying to just explain about the fun times and the music and some crazy stories. I wasn't trying to paint any of these bands as super important, although I think there are important bands in the book. It's just, it was an era of when rock and roll as we knew it and the music industry as we knew it was really sort of winding down. And I feel like these bands were kicking basic punk rock ass again, to put it in a silly way, and revving up punk rock and making it more about fun, fast rock and roll again. Basically, that's what it's about,
So why stop the book in 2001 then?
Yes. Well, that's become a pretty obvious, famous year for a number of reasons. But it just seemed like that was the time when I would say most of the bands that I talk about in my book and what I would consider the sort of important and slightly, slowly becoming influential bands in my book, they were all done by around 98. And then I think by 98 was the year that the press was like, it's the year of electronica, no one's going to play guitars anymore. And then all of a sudden around 2000, 2001, when the White Stripes and the Hives and the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the Donnas and all these bands were starting to get hyped as some sort of new garage rock scene, I remember me and all my friends being like, where was this press the last 10 years? And I like those bands. Those bands are all fine bands. I know the Hives personally. They're great guys. And it was right around 2001 that these bands started getting, a little press and making and I wanted to sort of show that there was a scene that these bands came out of. We used to see the Hives when they were 15, 16 years old coming to our shows, in Europe. And we recorded an album in 99 in Detroit, and the engineer was like, I'm like, who'd you record lately? He goes, oh, this band's okay. And he gave me the first White Stripes CD, And so, I mean, stuff. I feel like 2001 was right when that era, when those bands started getting press in England and America. And yeah, that carried over into like 2002, 2003. And then the Black Lips came around and King Kong Barbecue. And these are bands that now are, they're not million sellers, but they do well when they're on Vice and they tour a lot. But if I started getting into that, then it was going to be like a 1,000-page book. And it was just like, I got to cut this off somewhere. So 2001 seemed like, frankly, just kind of a date that people sort of know. But also, to me, it seemed like that year was when this whole scene, in a really odd way, got a little attention. And I know I'm talking a lot, but really quick, like when the White Stripes or the Hives would do interviews and mention the Gories or the Oblivions or the new Bomb Turks or, Mummies or Billy Childish. And these are all acts in my book that are not household names. And I realize that. And that's why I packed my book with a ton of bands.
I love that you mentioned that about bringing up bands like that, because it did make me go back and listen to the Mummies and listen to you guys again and Candy Snatchers, and it was just so much fun, and that was such awesome music.
Well, that's the thing is way back when I was a kid getting into music, if you said, by the end of the 80s, if you said, I like punk rock, most people by then thought it was like your mohawk or bald guy in the leather moshing in a pit, no girls at the show, super political, really ghettoized. And to me, punk rock was like, the Ramones are really fun. The Sex Pistols were fun, and a lot of forgotten bands from the late 70s, the Pagans from Cleveland, and different bands that really, me and all my friends seem to know about, the Saints from Australia. I mean, and we're just sort of forgotten, and it seemed like punk was like almost a dirty word with anybody who liked sort of interesting new music. So, and we found that even in our own town in Columbus. We just weren't finding many bands. There were some good bands in Columbus, but, if you said punk, they assume you were like a vegan hardcore band, like, And so I noticed that when we were around, suddenly I saw the Super Suckers and the Digits would come through town, or I would hear about the Mummies, or I'd buy a Devil Dogs record. And it was like, no, these bands are out there. And so as the years went on, I just felt that, when this idea for this book came up, with the help of my editor, Mike Edison, also was in the Raunch hands, and he was an editor for Screw Magazine and High Times, so he knows from where he speaks when it comes to
I don't know either of those magazines, by the way.
Sure she does. She knows them very well. But, and Mike was great to work with because he really helped me gear the book away from any sort of goofy memoir. Like if I got a little too personal or like some flighty story, he knew to be like, yeah, you don't need that, and really try to stick to just fun stories and let these bands get their, their stories.
Yeah, and you make a very compelling argument for Ohio's place in music history, not only home of the most serial killers and presidents,
My favorite statistic.
I must be, because you included it in the book. But a very compelling argument. I mean, you had me at the Cramps, Chrissy Hind, and Devo, but I will allow you to take the floor, Eric, and tell us more.
Well, that's the one. That's one of the lines from the book. She did her research, folks. I was just saying that, I was joking in the book, kind of, that there were 3 bands from Akron alone, the Cramps, Devo, and Chrissy Hind from the Pretenders. That trumped the entire musical output of the state of Florida. But anyway, and I'll still stand by that. And people are like, what about Tom Petty? But anyway, Tom Petty's fine. I like Tom Petty. The Waiting is a great song. But anyway, Ohio just, obviously I grew up there, so I have an affinity towards it. And what I tried to point out early in the book, because most reviews have been really nice for the book, but a couple have said like, well, especially writers on the West Coast sometimes, because I'm a little hard on Southern California sometimes. They're like, what is this, blah, blah, But I think as time goes on, a band like Para Ubu, who in the early 70s were really considered pretty much an art rock kind of band, and by the time me and my friends and bands in my book were rolling around, we would, we liked Para Ubu just like we would like the Velvet Underground, or we would like the Ramones, or we would like the Devil Dogs, or the Lazy Cowgirls. So it all was a part of a piece, or whatever that phrase is. And to me, those bands over time, they were very weird when they started. Electric Eels, Pagans. Believe me, I grew up in Cleveland. You couldn't even find a Dead Boys record. And the Dead Boys today would be considered a pretty straight up rock and roll band. But that shit was considered just weirdo stuff, even in Cleveland. Like my friend Robert says in the book, he's like, he was older than me, and he said, you had to go to the import section in Cleveland to find Para Ubu records, which is totally true. And now as time goes on and music has gotten a little stranger and kids can use like Pro Tools in their bedroom and make really weird sounding stuff, that stuff doesn't sound quite as foreign anymore, and it doesn't sound quite as strange. Well, the Electric Eels still sounds pretty fucking weird. But, and I think over time, the bands like today, what would be called garage rock bands, or the weirder ones like Times New Viking, Black Lips, maybe Deer Hunter, I don't know, stuff like that, probably look to Para Ubu or the Electric Eels or some of this Cleveland stuff, or even into my time, which was Thomas Jefferson Slave Apartments, Mike Repp, who was a producer in Cleveland who recorded a bunch of bands, the Gibson Brothers, who were from Columbus and they made the Cramp sound a little more polished, I mean, there was a lot of really interesting music that's come out of Ohio over the years. There's interesting music comes out everywhere, but I think for me, it's been real inspirational over the years just to see the weirdo crap and it's because it's cold and rainy and weird and snowy, and beer's really cheap. And rent's cheap, so you can stay in your crappy, cheap rent house, get drunk, and mope over the horrible weather.
It's so true. And can we just take a moment here to just acknowledge that the band names of this genre are the coolest band names in the universe?
Yes, I mean, Sons of Hercules, I think, is a very good name. The Dwarves is a great name, especially when you know that band. Dwarves is a great band. But yeah, I mean, that was sort of just that sense of fun. I really felt, I didn't get why, I remember we played this show, the Turks played one of our first shows, and we played with this local hardcore band. And they're like, we were sitting around talking to him, getting to know him, having some beers, and they're like, what do you like? I'm like, I like the Ramones. It goes, oh, that's cute, the Ramones. It's like, what do you mean cute? I'm like they're one of the great modern art projects of the 20th centuries, and they're really, really fun, and they're really fun. To this day, I never get sick of the Ramones. And it was almost like, well, they're fun. I'm like, well, what's wrong with fun? And then I saw in 1 week, I remember seeing Nirvana and the Smashing Pumpkins. Well, maybe 1 month, but anyway, it was around the same time. And this is, aging myself, but this is like, I don't know, 91 or something. And, they for what they did, they were great, But, they had the long hair, and they were doing this and rocking out their solos, and I was like, oh man, this is everything I thought was destroyed, and here it is back again. And of course, grunge became huge, And again, once again, this kind of fun music was somehow, critics would think that, well, it's just fun. And I'm like, well, it's not just fun. If these guys are slogging it out on the road and they're working hard and putting out records, I would say a quarter of the bands in this book are still active in one way or another. So, but just that sense of fun and a sense of humor and good, interesting, twisty, punny lyrics, and I was glad to see all that come back with all these kind of bands.
Yeah. I do want to ask you something, because as I was reading the book, I was thinking about this, because you hear about DIY so often, and Black Flag and like Husker Du.
Oh, yeah.
So Gunk Punk, would you say those guys were down with that DIY stuff, or they were taking it to a different level?
Well,
where do you put all that?
Basically, I do want to say Michael Azerrad did this book, Our Band Could Be Your Life. I can't remember. I think it came out in '91, and that's definitely an inspiration on my book for sure. Some of my proudest moments or whatever are when I read reviews that say, oh, this is like the next book in that sort of story. I'm like, wow, it's amazing. Of course, each successive books the bands make less and less money. Let's bear that in mind. But no, I think that every generation of bands looks back and sort of says how hard they had it. When I was a kid, we had to drag our amps through the snow. We only had horses and buggies.
Beers were a nickel.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I really, those bands laid the groundwork for hey, why don't we just do a show in someone's house? Why don't we do a show in a UAW hall? Why don't we do a show in the back of a closed McDonald's or whatever it is? They kind of laid the groundwork for and then soon audiences became okay with going to a shitty, crappy dive or somebody's basement to see a band. And so they definitely laid all the groundwork for that. Minor Threat, Black Flag, all those bands. REM too, Husker Du. And those are some of my favorite bands when I was a kid. The Replacements are, I think, a big influence on a lot of the bands in my book. And I think with this, I think we were able to take these bands in my book were able to take advantage of some of that and be able to play alternative venues and realize that okay, I'm probably not going to get signed to some major label. Who cares at this point if we can afford a van or we can rent a van or borrow our dad's or whatever we have to do to go around the country and play for people. We can make our own T-shirts and you slowly learn how to do it. And that was part of what I wanted to show in the book too, is that the expansion of that kind of DIY network, but also I try to be a little chronological in the book, and there's a chapter about bands that actually did sign to majors, like the Muffs, Rocket from the Crypt, Super Suckers, John Spencer Blues Explosion, and these bands that got some press and got some attention and did make the leap to a major label and were spending $50,000 on a music video and all that. I wanted that to be in the book too, and I've had some sort of punk fans be like, fuck that, who cares about major labels? But I wanted to show that, that era, for kids even today. I worked at CMJ and I would meet interns who were 20, 21. That's not a kid exactly, and their younger brothers and the younger brothers of those people are not really, I hope that if they see a book like mine, they can get a sense for what it was like back then, good and bad. And the good stuff is sometimes bands did get paid, and the bad part was that there was a lot of waste and there was a lot of, broken hearts and just all that crap that happens with bad record deals. But, so I just wanted to show the scope, because whether anyone wants to believe this or not, any one of these bands would have taken a $200,000 advance from a major label. Of course, any band would. Why not, right? I would say that most of these bands were not I would never sign to a major. They weren't that part of the DIY scene that was in Azerrad's book. And I'm not saying all the bands in Azerrad's book were like that either, but this was more like the rock and roll bands. They wanted to go and play for people and get excited and have fun and make sure there was a good after party, and just have fun, flirt with girls and do all this stuff that you should do and not be apologetic for. Just go out and do it. And if it means sleeping on someone's floor, or it means crashing with the girl that has 20 cats or whatever, you just do that stuff.
Top 3 albums we must listen to.
Top 3. It is impossible to do.
5 you want?
I'll do 5.
Okay.
And this, believe me, this is, of course, I'm going to be walking back to work from this. I'm going to go, dope. But I'm going to start with probably one of the 2 Pagans compilations on Crypt. They're CD comps. Go look at the Crypt website, Crypt Records website. And that's pre my book, but I got to throw that in there. I would say the Devil Dogs Big Beef Bonanza. Oh, this sounds horrible, doesn't it? New Bomb Turks, Destroy Oh Boy. I'm sorry.
Who are they again?
I'm trying. You know what? I'm a humble guy overall. Okay, this is really freaking hard. Pussy Galore's Right Now. So what is that, 4? And I would say, to jump forward, if I can do a something/something, I would say Hives, Veni Vidi Vicious, and the Clone Defects first album. And that's at the very end of my book. But you know what? There are so many. Again, I'm sure I'm forgetting something. There's Great Lazy Cowgirls records. Oh, I'm sorry. The number one, of course, should be The Dwarves' Blood, Guts, and Pussy.
There is a great list in the book, too. So when you buy the book, let me take out my junky paper.
Yeah, take your notes.
Take my notes out. When you get the book, you get this great playlist in the back. And now with Spotify, heck yeah, you can just sit there all day and just do that. Or Turntable FM, you can totally have the greatest DJ room ever.
And there is a little card in the back with a code. You go to my blog, my Tumblr blog site, whatever you kids call it, is weneverlearnbook.com. weneverlearnbook.com. And that's where you go and put in your little code, and you get a 20-song free comp. Almost all the songs are previously unreleased or different mixes. I spent 2 years of my life on this and tracked down flyers and pictures and things that came all the way from France and Japan and Colorado and all over the place. So.
You know, I know I shouldn't say the words real quick to you, but but real quick, tell me about this cover.
Ah, yes, the cover. First of all, the lettering throughout the book, the sort of hand lettering, was done by the great Cliff Mott, who has done a lot of work for Cracked Magazine and for Crip Records, and he's a great man. But the picture is actually of the Spits. Now, the Spits, I'm forgetting the year the Spits started. I'm guessing it's around 98. The photo itself is from 2003. And I remember telling my editor, I was like, him and Aaron Lefkov, a very good friend of mine who was the publicist for my book when it came out. He was a publicist, and they both loved this picture of the Spits. And I said, well, I like it. It's a good picture, but I'm like, I really wanted a picture of He Who Cannot Be Named, who is the often naked guitarist of the Dwarves. That's what I wanted on the cover, but we never got that perfect picture that just graphically worked as a cover, you know? Plus, he's always naked and really disgusting spots all over him. You don't want to know what they are. So anyway, so they love this picture. I said, but it's from 2003, and this, I don't really talk much about the Spits in the book because I consider their influence and their sort of like action and their touring and all that came like a little bit later than 2001. And like now they're doing great, and they're having their records reissued, and everybody loves the Spits, and they're a lot of fun. I just saw them a few weeks ago.
Eric, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I talk too much, don't I?
No. You're a fun guest. I had a ball. And I really enjoyed the book. I'm not an expert in this area of music at all, and it was a ball to read. You really inspired me to go look up the bands, listen to the music.
Thanks.
And I think that's the biggest thing anyone could get out of the book as well, you know, to just learn these guys' stories and listen to that music.
It's just about trying to give a little ink to some bands that really worked hard and traveled, and some of them were successful, and most of them at least might have paid the ramen noodle bills when they got home from tour. And you know, it was everybody that I interviewed in this book, there were only maybe 2 or 3 of them that genuinely sounded awfully embittered. And the rest of them were just like laughing it up, you know? It was really fun to catch up with some old friends and talk to people I never got to talk to in the past, like the Mummies. I never really got to know those guys. So, you know, stuff like that was a lot of fun.
Very cool. Well, all the way from the Lower East Side, Eric Davidson.
Thanks, Kimberly.
Thank you.
Bye.